There's a question almost no one in Washington dares to ask out loud. Not in press conferences, not in congressional hearings, and certainly not on cable news panels where conversation moves fast and real scrutiny moves slow. Who actually controls American foreign policy? Is it the voters who show up every 4 years believing their ballots shape the direction of the country? Is it Congress, constitutionally entrusted with declaring war and controlling the purse strings? Is it the President of the United States, the elected commander-in-chief sworn to protect American interests above all else? Or is it something else, something less visible, less accountable, and far more entrenched? For decades, Americans have been told that U.S. foreign policy is guided by national interest, by security, by stability, by economic prosperity, by the protection of American citizens at home and abroad, that it exists to deter threats before they reach our shores, that it is calculated, strategic, and grounded in cold assessments of risk. But look at the pattern. Look at the wars. Look at the military aid packages. Look at the diplomatic shielding at the United Nations. Look at the aircraft carriers repositioned at moments of tension. And ask yourself something simple, something rational. Do these decisions always serve the American people first, or do they consistently align with the strategic priorities of a foreign nation? Specifically, Israel. That question isn't hateful. It isn't radical. It isn't rooted in prejudice. It is not anti-anything. It's about sovereignty. Because if the United States, the most powerful country in the world, is shaping major aspects of its foreign policy around the security framework of another country, then something fundamental has shifted. And the American people deserve clarity about that shift. Alliances are normal. Partnerships are strategic. Cooperation is essential in a complex world. But automatic alignment, reflexive defense, billions transferred without meaningful debate. That requires scrutiny. Tonight, we break it down carefully, not emotionally, not rhetorically, but structurally, because patterns matter, and patterns reveal priorities. Every year, the United States sends billions of dollars in military aid to Israel, not as loans that must be repaid, not as conditional packages tied to measurable benchmarks, but as direct assistance. This support spans decades. It has become routine, institutionalized into long-term agreements that extend beyond individual administrations. It rarely faces serious opposition on the House or Senate floor. Votes pass with overwhelming bipartisan margins. Speeches praising the alliance are plentiful. Dissenting voices are rare. Contrast that with domestic spending debates, border security funding, fiercely contested. Infrastructure modernization, negotiated for months, sometimes years. Healthcare reforms, polarizing. Disaster relief packages for American communities hit by hurricanes, wildfires, or floods, often delayed over cost concerns. Yet foreign military assistance to Israel moves swiftly. Why? Why is urgency applied abroad while gridlock dominates at home? The official explanation is strategic alliance. Israel is described as America's closest ally in the Middle East, a democratic partner in a volatile region, a reliable intelligence-sharing hub, a technological innovator, a stabilizing force. But stabilization has not defined the Middle East for decades. The region has experienced continuous turbulence. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Lebanon, Gaza, Iran tensions, proxy conflicts stretching across multiple borders. American involvement is frequently intertwined with these dynamics. Supporters argue that aiding Israel strengthens regional balance and deters adversaries. Critics ask whether the aid instead deepens entanglement. The financial dimension alone deserves attention. Billions annually accumulate into staggering totals over time. These funds are borrowed money, added to national debt that American taxpayers ultimately carry. At a moment when the United States faces record deficits, rising interest payments, and fiscal strain, foreign military commitments remain largely insulated from austerity conversations. And the scale isn't only monetary. Aid packages often include advanced weapon systems, missile defense funding, joint research programs, and pre-positioned U.S. military stockpiles inside Israel itself. That level of integration goes beyond symbolic alliance. It creates operational interdependence, and interdependence changes incentives. If one nation's security doctrine becomes embedded inside another's funding structure, the distinction between independent strategy and shared strategy begins to blur. The American taxpayer funds it. The American soldier may one day enforce it. But does the American voter fully debate it, or has it become automatic? When spending decisions no longer require persuasion, when they pass as a matter of political routine, accountability diminishes. And when accountability diminishes, democracy weakens. This is not an argument against alliances. It is an argument for transparency. Every dollar sent abroad should be defensible in terms of American national interest, not assumed, not inherited, not politically untouchable. Because when debate disappears, so does oversight, and oversight is the foundation of a republic. Now consider the broader strategic pattern over the last 25 years. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, the prolonged occupation that followed, the regime change efforts in Syria, the NATO intervention in Libya, the sustained maximum pressure campaign on Iran, the constant carrier deployments to the eastern Mediterranean during regional flare-ups. In nearly every instance, these actions aligned closely with Israeli security priorities. That does not mean they were executed on Israel's behalf. It means their outcomes corresponded with long-standing Israeli strategic concerns, particularly regarding hostile neighboring regimes and Iran's regional influence. Israel has long viewed Iran as its primary existential threat. Iranian leadership has issued hostile rhetoric toward Israel. Tehran supports armed groups across the region that oppose Israeli interests. From Israel's perspective, the threat is real and immediate. But here's the strategic question Americans must ask: why does Washington adopt the same hierarchy of threat perception? Iran is a regional power. It exerts influence through proxies. It seeks nuclear capability, but it lacks the logistical capacity to invade the United States. It has no blue water navy capable of projecting force across the Atlantic. It poses no conventional territorial threat to American soil. Yet American policy treats Iran as a central global adversary. Sanctions escalate, carrier groups reposition. Diplomatic channels narrow. And whenever tensions spike between Israel and Iran, whether through airstrikes, proxy exchanges, or nuclear negotiations, the United States shifts military posture almost immediately. American resources. American risk exposure. American escalation ladders. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's pattern recognition. When Israel faces escalation, the United States responds as though it were facing escalation itself. The question is not whether Israel has the right to defend itself, it does. The question is whether America is obligated to mirror every strategic confrontation automatically, because automatic alignment reduces flexibility, and flexibility is essential in foreign policy. A superpower must retain the ability to differentiate between its own existential threats and those of its allies. When that distinction fades, sovereignty becomes complicated, and complicated sovereignty can become constrained sovereignty. Strategic alignment between allies is not unusual. In fact, shared intelligence and coordinated defense planning are hallmarks of long-term partnerships. The concern arises when alignment becomes assumption, when escalation in one capital automatically triggers movement in another without visible deliberation. Consider how quickly American naval assets reposition when hostilities increase between Israel and its adversaries. Carrier strike groups are deployed. Air defense systems are activated. Public statements from Washington echo the language of solidarity and deterrence. The signal is unmistakable: the United States stands ready. That readiness may deter adversaries, but it also communicates something else, that Israel's regional confrontations carry the weight of American military power behind them. This changes strategic calculations across the Middle East. Adversaries no longer measure their actions solely against Israel, they measure them against Washington. And that fusion of deterrence expands the scale of potential conflict. When Iraq was invaded in 2003, proponents argued the war would reshape the Middle East in ways favorable to Western interests and Israeli security alike. Saddam Hussein had fired missiles at Israel during the Gulf War. Removing him eliminated a hostile regime. But the aftermath destabilized the region, empowered Iran's influence in Iraq, and ignited sectarian conflict that spread beyond borders. American troops bore the cost. American taxpayers financed reconstruction. Thousands of American families carried the consequences. The stated objective was American security. The regional outcome was far more complex. In Syria, calls for regime change similarly aligned with weakening an Iranian ally and disrupting Hezbollah supply lines. Yet direct American intervention never materialized at full scale, partly because of war fatigue and partly because of geopolitical risk involving Russia. Still, the pattern remained where Israeli strategic interests were implicated, Washington's rhetoric and posture sharpened. This does not prove subordination, it illustrates synchronization, and synchronization without transparent national debate invites scrutiny. Foreign policy should reflect American priorities first. That does not exclude cooperation, but it demands clarity about objectives. Is the goal preventing direct threats to American soil? Or is it reshaping the balance of power in the Middle East in ways that primarily secure an ally? When these goals overlap, consensus is easy. When they diverge, which prevails? That is the sovereignty question beneath the surface. Beyond military alignment lies diplomatic shielding. At the United Nations, the United States has repeatedly exercised its veto power to block resolutions critical of Israel. This pattern spans administrations of both parties. Republican or Democrat, the reflex remains consistent. Some resolutions address settlement expansion. Others concern military operations. Some involve humanitarian investigations. Many are symbolic, but the American veto arrives reliably. Supporters argue that the United Nations exhibits disproportionate focus on Israel compared to other nations with far worse human rights records. They contend that the veto corrects institutional bias. Critics counter that automatic vetoes undermine America's credibility as a neutral broker in peace negotiations. Regardless of one's view, the consistency is striking. Diplomatic cover is extended almost reflexively. All alliances involve unusual. NATO allies defend one another. Treaty obligations exist. But Israel is not a NATO member. The U.S.-Israel relationship is unique, deeply integrated yet not formally bound by a mutual defense treaty requiring automatic war participation. So why does the diplomatic posture resemble unconditional obligation? When support becomes predictable regardless of circumstance, leverage diminishes. Leverage is central to diplomacy. It allows allies to influence one another constructively. Conditional backing can encourage restraint, negotiation, or reform. Unconditional backing removes that mechanism. If Washington signals that vetoes will arrive regardless of events on the ground, incentives shift. Transparency also suffers. Major foreign policy decisions occur through executive agreements, intelligence sharing arrangements, and classified briefings that the public never sees. Congress often defers to leadership. Media coverage frames events through moral language rather than strategic evaluation. The result is a narrowed debate. Instead of asking whether certain actions serve long-term American interests, discussion centers on loyalty, alliance strength, and moral solidarity. Moral language has power. But foreign policy cannot rely solely on moral framing. It requires strategic calculus. When voters lack access to the strategic rationale behind diplomatic shielding, democratic accountability erodes. Foreign policy becomes insulated from public consent, and insulation breeds complacency. A republic depends on informed consent. If citizens cannot meaningfully evaluate why vetoes are issued or military aid is expanded, they cannot meaningfully influence direction. The alliance may be justified, but justification must be articulated repeatedly and transparently. Otherwise, it becomes assumption. Assumptions are rarely examined. In Washington, influence rarely operates through dramatic backroom conspiracies. It functions through institutions, through think tanks, lobbying organizations, advocacy groups, donor networks, policy advisory councils, and media ecosystems. Pro-Israel lobby organizations rank among the most organized and effective foreign policy advocacy groups in the United States. This is not speculation. It is widely acknowledged across the political spectrum. They host conferences attended by senior lawmakers. They track legislative voting records. They mobilize donors. They facilitate policy trips abroad. They cultivate long-term relationships with staffers who later rotate into executive branch roles. This is legal, it is transparent, and it is powerful. Members of Congress are acutely aware that criticism of Israel can trigger primary challenges, donor withdrawal, or organized opposition campaigns. Conversely, vocal support often brings fundraising advantages and institutional backing. Political incentives shape behavior. When both major parties compete to demonstrate unwavering support, policy alignment becomes structural. Structural alignment differs from strategic deliberation. Deliberation requires periodic reassessment. It allows for changing circumstances. It invites dissenting views. Structural alignment resists reassessment. When questioning the alliance carries political cost, but affirming it carries reward, debate narrows. And when debate narrows, policy hardens. Again, this is not an argument against the existence of lobbying. Many groups lobby: defense contractors, environmental organizations, pharmaceutical companies, labor unions. The difference lies in the foreign policy dimension. When domestic lobbying shapes tax policy, consequences remain internal. When foreign policy lobbying influences military posture, consequences extend globally. War sanctions, diplomatic ruptures. These decisions carry human and financial cost far beyond Washington. If legislators perceive certain foreign policy positions as politically untouchable, they are less likely to scrutinize them rigorously. That dynamic can produce inertia, and inertia in foreign policy can entangle a nation in conflicts not fully debated by its citizens. It is not anti-Israel to argue that American foreign policy should prioritize American interests first. It is foundational. Sovereignty means elected officials weigh alliances against national benefit continually, not reflexively. If questioning an alliance becomes taboo, democracy weakens. Because healthy democracies tolerate scrutiny, they require it. Now we arrive at the core issue, the sovereignty question. If U.S. foreign policy consistently mirrors Israel's security priorities, if American military assets are deployed whenever Israel faces escalation, if billions in aid move with minimal public debate, if diplomatic shielding is reflexive rather than conditional, then at what point does alliance evolve into dependency? Dependency does not require formal treaties. It does not require public declarations. It can emerge gradually through structural habits, through long-term funding commitments, integrated defense systems, intelligence fusion, and synchronized threat perception. Over time, policymakers begin to think in shared terms. What threatens Israel threatens us. What destabilizes Israel destabilizes us. What Israel identifies as an existential threat becomes central to Washington's agenda. But sovereign nations must differentiate between shared interest and automatic obligation. The chessboard metaphor is not dramatic. It is analytical. In geopolitics, pieces move according to incentives. Is the United States the king, directing the board based on its own national calculus? Or has it become a piece whose movements are partially determined by the strategic anxieties of an ally? That distinction matters because consequences fall primarily on Americans. When aircraft carriers deploy, it is American sailors who board them. When wars are authorized, it is American troops who fight them. When sanctions escalate tensions, it is American businesses and consumers who feel economic ripple effects. When debt rises to finance overseas commitments, it is American taxpayers who absorb the interest. And when geopolitical tensions spiral into broader confrontation, it is American cities that could ultimately face retaliation in a worst-case scenario. Alliances are not charity. They are calculated partnerships. The question is whether this partnership remains calculated or whether it has become reflexive. Reflexes bypass deliberation. Deliberation is the essence of sovereignty. Several foreign policy scholars across ideological lines have warned that U.S. strategy in the Middle East often appears reactive rather than independently strategic. Some argue that America's credit mediator diminishes when its diplomatic posture appears indistinguishable from Israeli objectives. In negotiations involving Palestinians, Iran, or regional normalization agreements, Washington's role is frequently perceived not as neutral broker but as aligned participant. Perception shapes diplomacy. If regional actors believe the United States will default to Israel's position regardless of circumstance, they may bypass Washington entirely, seeking alternative patrons such as Russia or China. That shift carries long-term consequences for American influence. Other analysts note that unconditional support reduces leverage. Leverage functions through conditionality, through the possibility of withholding assistance, adjusting diplomatic backing, or recalibrating military coordination. When backing is guaranteed, leverage disappears. Without leverage, influence weakens. Ironically, unconditional support can limit Washington's ability to shape Israeli behavior precisely because it removes bargaining power. Former intelligence officials, speaking candidly after leaving office, have acknowledged that foreign influence in Washington is rarely covert. It is institutional. It flows through advisory roles, policy fellowships, campaign finance networks, and revolving door relationships between government and think tanks. This does not imply secret control. It reflects structural alignment reinforced by political incentives. When the political cost of questioning the relationship exceeds the cost of supporting it, policy becomes predictable. Predictability simplifies messaging, but it also eliminates accountability. The American public rarely witnesses a comprehensive strategic debate over whether certain Middle East escalations genuinely serve U.S. interests independent of Israeli concerns. Instead, debates are framed through moral obligation. Support is described as defending democracy. Criticism is often framed as betrayal. But moral framing, while emotionally compelling, does not substitute for strategic doctrine. Foreign policy must answer practical questions. Does this action reduce direct threats to American citizens? Does it enhance long-term stability? Does it prevent larger wars? Does it preserve economic strength? If support for an ally meets those criteria, it is defensible. If it does not, reassessment is necessary. The problem is not alliance. The problem is absence of periodic reassessment. Democracies must reevaluate long-term commitments. Otherwise, commitments become inertia, and inertia can carry a nation to conflicts it never fully chose.